if you put vanilla pudding in your chocolate chip cookie mix, they don't get crunchy or hard. They're always moist and soft.
That sounds amazing.
Doesn't it sound amazing?
Yeah, I just put vanilla pudding in everything. Casseroles, anything. That's just so
casseroles. Tuna. You know what's great in a tuna casserole? Vanilla pudding.
And wrapped in bacon.
But that's actually true.
Our goal on this podcast is to know Jesus better and by the power of his Spirit do better so together we can be a little better. Well, welcome to A Little Better Podcast. So glad you've joined us this week for week number 2 of My Relationships Are Falling Apart, where, frankly, it got real. So Drew has stepped right into the fray. So, Drew, why don't you remind us in 60 seconds what you shared on Sunday?
Yeah, we talked about conflict. How do you handle conflict when it comes in your relationships? And we looked at the book of James, and James really doesn't give us any excuse. He says, hey, the first place you got to look is you. You're the central part. And so we talked about how do we handle conflict, because it's in every relationship. How do we handle it God's way? And ultimately, we landed on understanding how you sinfully respond to conflict. What is that default natural strategy? And then shifting the focus off of you into really the person you're fighting with, considering them with the ultimate goal of not winning an argument, not being right, but winning the health of the relationship. And so I think ultimately you can lean on conflict, right? It's going to happen. It can be an amazing thing. God can redeem it and make your relationships through it if you do and handle conflict God's way.
Yeah. James is a real big, the problem is you kind of guy, isn't he?
Yeah.
Doesn't he also say, we can't even say we're tempted because that comes from you. It's what it's what we want. That's the problem. Wanting the wrong thing, too much of it. So, you mentioned conflict arising every time you step onto a stage to talk about conflict.
Yeah.
It's like God just walks you right through your own little laboratory in preparing. So, you want to talk about this time, in terms of the conflict? Do you want to talk about a lifetime of what is the good that God does or has done, like in your life through conflict?
Well, I think, remove conflict from the equation. Most things in our life that are hard and difficult that we have to work at are the most rewarding. And that's true in relationships. Like, I've been married going on 16 years with Ashley, and we've navigated all kinds of conflict in our relationship. Some really stupid, like just low-hanging fruit, right? We've argued over the shower curtain, like whether it should be open or closed. We argue over what design element goes where. Like, we've argued over some really shallow and stupid things. And then we've argued over really important and hard things. Like, I think of our last most difficult argument was, should we have a fourth child or not? Ashley and I were on two totally different sides of that equation. Obviously, Baylor is here, so she won that conflict. But conflict is everywhere, and it's easy to step into. And honestly, this last conflict that we had was just over my impatience, to be honest. You would think when you're prepping a message and you're like, okay, consider the other person, you would do that. But listen, my natural default strategy to conflict is to fight. I love to argue. My wife says it's like the Karshner spiritual gift is arguing. And so I'm really good at arguing. I'm really good at making me look good. And I handled it poorly, and I had to own it and be convicted of my own message.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength, unfortunately. I'm kind of curious, in your marriage, would you say that you're a pair of fighters, or is she a freezer, a flyer, or a fighter?
What's unique is, this is sad, right?
I'm getting personal here. Sorry about that.
I feel like I am a unique blend of fight or flight. So there are times when I'm ready to just rumble. Like, I'm like, nope, I'm going to win this argument, and I'm going to go after it. But there's a lot of times where I'm like, okay, I've tried fighting and it didn't work. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just not going to talk to you. I'm going to give you the silent treatment.
Yeah. I think we've probably all adopted each of those roles, right, at some time. And I also think it's probably, there's the person who might be intimidated at work and a bit of a runner, a conflict avoider, but when they get home, they get right into it. I mean, it's just different relationships might bring out different things in us. I think for Karen and I, I'm a fighter. I'm going to win, the argument. And Karen is more of a runner. I mean, it sounds like such a negative term, but, in her defense, she's like, you're being ridiculous, Brad. And I am, right? So she's not even going to, engage, and withdraw. And we've had to learn over time. So your advice, of course, is to consider the other person. So a fighter considering a runner would need to do that extra work of patience, of the listening. You talked about asking questions, and the runner, I think it's a challenge to lean in and engage.
Who wants to have a conversation with a fighter?
Yeah.
Right? Like, yikes. And I think some of our responses depend on, like, our life. So for me, I deal with conflict a lot of my day at work. So sometimes I don't want to go home and deal with it. So I can easily slip into, like, I'm just going to ignore it or run from it, right? So if I've had, like, a hard day at work, hard conversations, I don't want to come home and do that, right? And so if conflict arises, I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to go watch the game, and Ashley and I can talk whenever we feel like it, right? Or when I feel like it. And so I think you just got to be careful. The point is we respond to conflict usually from a sinful way, in a selfish way. And ultimately that's what James is trying to get us to see is we are prone to selfishness. And one of the hardest things in conflict is to get your eyes off of what you want and onto what do we need? What is best for us? There's more than one person in the equation, and trying to get two sides that are going the opposite direction to come together.
Yeah. You mentioned that selfishness, and you also mentioned 6 selfish goals we often have in conflict. And I thought it was a pretty good and comprehensive list. Do you remember where that list came from? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so if it was good and comprehensive, obviously it didn't come from me. So actually, like, a great resource as we navigate and finish up this series in a couple weeks has been a book that... I lost his name.
Tripp, right?
David Tripp, yes.
Yeah.
David Tripp. It's Relationships, a Mess Worth Making. And I just love that title in general because, when you talk about conflict, right, that's the messy side of relationships. And basically the point of the title in the book is like, yes, relationships are messy, they're hard, but it's worth it if you do it and handle it the right way. And so if you've never read that book, I'd really encourage it to read it. We'll put it in the show notes as a resource.
Yeah, definitely put it in the show notes. And spoiler alert, week 4, I think, of this series, the online campus plans on giving some of those books away.
Okay,
actually,
let's go.
I think you have a choice between that book and another one, but you definitely have the opportunity. So tune in online. Make sure you're ready for
I like your plug
for that.
there.
Yeah.
Selfish plug. There it
selfish,
is.
It's a selfish plug. Yeah. Do you remember the 6? And I didn't write them down, and I'm trying to think. I think I remembered pleasure.
Yep.
I remembered comfort.
Yep.
I remembered recognition and acceptance. I think
I don't
was
think
in there.
maybe acceptance was
I think
one.
it was acceptance in the
Power
and control.
Control.
We got 6, guys.
Yes.
We got all 6. But I thought there was a pretty complete list. We keep talking about selfishness. And what I've been thinking about, I didn't even put this in the notes or questions, but it's easy to say let's not be selfish. But I think there's a holy selfishness. I think that I was reading about Jonathan Edwards, I think the first sermon he preached was about, Christian happiness. But basically he said that God, it's reasonable for us. God wants us to be reasonable about gaining an advantage. But we're just misdirected on what the advantage is, right? We think it is power or control or accept these different things, but really the greatest advantage is God himself, right? To get more of him, to have communion with God, and just to know, so selfishly, we do eternally, maximize, our happiness, our purpose, our joy when we find it, in the right place. But I'm so distracted by those counterfeits.
Oh yeah, and I think what James does in chapter 4 is so unique. I love how he brings God into our relationships, because it's really easy to think that, in my conflict, no matter who it's with, that ultimately it's just between me and that person. Mm-hmm. But what is often true is when I'm handling conflict negatively, there is some correlation to my relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And when I am selfish, James says, when you are proud, mm-hmm. God opposes you.
Right.
Right. And I always just have this picture. It's football season, right? So mm-hmm. I have this picture of when I'm proud or I'm selfish, kind of the same thing. Right. God stiff-arming me.
Right.
Right. Literally stiff-arming me, opposing me. Right.
Interesting.
That's kind of the imagery. You can take it or leave it. But and what I often don't from a big perspective is I don't realize how much my selfishness affects my relationship with God, and how much that affects my relationship with my wife, with my kids, with my coworkers, right? There's just a beautiful correlation that if I get right with God first, that will have an amazing impact mm-hmm. on my relationships. Why? Well, because if you're right with God, your selfishness goes out the window.
Right.
A lot of times I can't get right with others from a selfish perspective mm-hmm. unless I first get right with God from a selfish perspective. Yeah,
that's good. I've been dwelling a lot on, there's a parable where Jesus talks about, you're going to a banquet, don't sit at don't go up to the highest seat and put yourself in it, because chances are you're going to get knocked down. So you're talking about, we're proud, God opposes you. Yeah. Go find that lowest seat mm-hmm. and then to be surprised, say, no, sir, you belong, up here. So I've been trying to think about how are the ways I'm learning humility or fighting for the lower seat, and trying to recognize that. And those were the wheels that got turning when you started talking about when our pride springs up, God is opposed to it. I suppose it makes him righteously angry, but it also makes him wanting us to have something better. No, you ruin it for yourself, and it's certainly going to play out in bad results in your relationships.
100%. And what I always aspire to is obviously Jesus, and if you read the Gospels, it's amazing how Jesus handled conflict, right? It's so countercultural to how I handle conflict, mm-hmm. right? Okay, the conflict with Judas, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus called Judas out, right? He told Judas, he didn't specifically, but when right before he washes the disciples' feet, he's like, hey, one of you is going to betray me. Mm-hmm. And if I knew that, okay, in my life, if I knew one of my friends or my staff members were going to betray me, mm-hmm. I'd be like, you're out of here.
Right.
I would have handled it so that doesn't happen. But what if Jesus did that? What if he got rid of Judas and Judas didn't have the ability to turn him in? There goes the entire plan of salvation, right?
Right.
Okay, that's one conflict. And then he's on trial. And when people accuse me of things that I didn't do, what's the first thing I do? Oh, I didn't do that. I'm innocent. And Jesus is just silent. Some of me is in my own fighting sinful nature to respond, I'm like, Jesus, fight. Why are you fighting? You're innocent. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't.
Yeah. That is so challenging, to follow that example of Jesus for us. And I'm the same way. I want to defend myself. I want people to know, the truth, and to fight for it. But can we really be at peace with God taking care of it at the end? You as a leader, I think any leader has to come to that place where you have to just make peace with the fact that you can't please everyone. Yeah. That there are people who are always going to, misconstrue your motives, think the worst of you. And you can't go around and fix all that. But
no, you can't. That's for sure. Yeah, there's a certain level where you have to be, God's got this, right? And
God's got this.
But when you're so heavily involved, right, it makes it so much harder to relinquish that, to let it go. Mm-hmm. And I'm very challenged by the way Jesus handled conflict.
I want to talk about the bananas. So that was interesting. I mean,
You never know what's going to come out on a Sunday.
I wondered if by the third service those bananas were just going to fall off the stem.
I was waiting for that to happen. I'm not going to lie.
Those were slimy bananas. I don't know how old they were, but you were making the point that there is something difficult, disgusting, hard that God can use for good.
Yeah.
And you're talking about, we all, I mean, to an extent, we'd all love to live a conflict-free life. I avoid conflict like the plague myself. I've talked about being a fighter with my wife and arguing for things. Hopefully I've gotten better, over time. But I do know out there, in other places, there's just places conflict makes me nauseous. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just so upsetting to me. I want to avoid it. But you said, there are ways for good, to engage conflict in a healthy way.
So here's what I believe. I believe what we want won't take us to where we want to be. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, who doesn't, like, if we all could just pick, like, hey, no one really wants conflict, right? Mm-hmm. If you could pick a conflict-free relationship, probably 100 out of 100 of us would pick it.
Sure.
Here's the lie in that, though, is that's the most shallow relationship you'll ever experience. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have conflict in your relationship, I believe there's an absence of growth, an absence of maturity that conflict produces, right? Mm-hmm. I've seen it in my own marriage, right? Like, I have seen my marriage grow over 16 years through conflict that has been arose. I don't know the proper English word, but like, yeah, who doesn't? I don't want to have to deal with conflict, but man, my marriage is better because of it, right? And even in my walk with God, there's times where we have conflict with God. Okay, when my dad died, I had conflict with God, right? Why in the world would you take my dad? I'm not happy about this. I'm actually pretty ticked, God, about this. And through that conflict, my trust, my ability to lean in and press into God just grew exponentially because of conflict.
Yeah.
And so I think what we want doesn't take us to where we want to be, healthy, strong relationships.
Right.
And so what's the gap there? It's learning to navigate conflict in a healthy and biblical way.
Yeah. I was thinking marriage before you used the word marriage, in your response there. And I certainly don't want to communicate that people who aren't married, won't have the opportunity to grow as they should, right? There's all kinds of relationships, there's circumstances, there's suffering, there's all kinds of difficulties and challenges that God uses. I mean, Paul was never married, right? Jesus was never married. But there's a book, I believe, called Sacred Marriage, and we'll put in the show notes too, because I can't remember the author's name offhand, but his thesis is marriage is not meant to make you happy, it's meant to make you holy. And so when you talk about marriage, because I think about it too, I mean, Karen and I have been married over 30 years, and I just think about how God has changed us, in that. And I would have to admit, a lot of it has come through conflict, and it's, so I would encourage people who are having challenges in their marriages, don't assume that's a sign that you made the wrong choice. Don't assume that's a reason to bail.
Well, really, there's no sign you made the wrong choice, because if you're married, that is the choice.
Yeah,
absolutely. And obviously, like, don't overbelieve that, right? Like, obviously, you're in a marriage relationship where you're being abused, right? Like, again, we're not talking about those types of conflict. We're talking about everyday trials and arguments in relationships, marriage, coworkers, friends, and so.
Yeah, I'm glad you cycled back to that. You mentioned that in your sermon too, right from the beginning. We're not excusing evil and wrong,
that's
and
right.
there are things that happen. So never want to excuse that, but the good God can use. There's a healthy kind of conflict. I remember a pre-preach once when we have the feedback back and forth, and you and Nate Miller and Scott Bixby, you got at it. And I grew up in a family where we just don't raise our voices to each other. We avoid conflict like at all costs. And that was making me really nervous, but it was a healthy discussion. You guys, there weren't feelings or personal reputations involved, but you were fighting, for the best outcome, between you and what was going back and forth. So some of us, it's hard to learn, get past the nausea, find a healthy way, to proceed.
Well, and I think,
conflict.
depending on what type of conflict you're talking about, I think being able to see, like, at some level, some of the conflict that you wrestle with, you're both fighting for the same thing. Mm-hmm. You're just going at it from different perspectives.
Right.
And sometimes just softening a conflict is simply saying, okay, listen, we both want the same thing. Mm-hmm. So let's not get angry at each other when we're after the same goal, because that's when the enemy wins, right? Mm-hmm. When we want the same thing, we think we go different routes about it, and we're mad at each other. Like we don't achieve what we wanted, and boom. So again, I think that goes back to like the illustration I gave with my wife is like, remind yourself, man, usually the person you're fighting with is not your enemy.
Yeah.
Right? They aren't there. Usually you guys are after, at some level, the same thing. It's just different ways. And so learning to hear and consider the other person is so helpful.
Yeah, personally, I thought that was a very powerful part of your message, when just to put that pause and say, honey, I'm not the enemy.
Yeah.
But that we do have an enemy who's working behind the scenes.
He's trying to make us enemies.
Outcome. All right. I want to go out on this question.
All
right. So, and I've already been through one group discussion. I'll be through another, that's giving feedback, that's wrestling with these things. But what do you say to the person who says, why are you putting it all on me? Is that?
It's kind of an ode to this coming weekend, which I like. Right. I would say the reason why James does that is because you can only control you. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'll give you a glimpse into next week. We're going to talk about how, the Bible really calls us to live at peace with everyone. And Paul specifically says, as it depends on you. And what I've learned, even in conflict, is I can't control how whoever responds. Mm-hmm. I can't control their actions. Mm-hmm. I can control me.
Yeah.
Right? I can control my heart and, obviously with God's help. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I think James says, you got to look at you, and you're a huge part of the conflict, because if you remove your selfishness, if you remove your desire to please yourself, it's really hard to fight with somebody who isn't selfish.
Right.
Who thinks of you first, right? It's really hard to I've been there, right? Like where I've been in such a fight mode, and my wife's like, fine, you're right. And no, I'm still ready to fight. And it's, what does the Bible say? A soft answer, turn away wrath, right? And so I think that's why I think, Matthew 7, right? Take the speck out of your eye before you remove the log in somebody else's, because you can pull that out. And so I think it's really important to know that. Mm-hmm.
Well, listen, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. So love what you did this week, and that beautifully sets up what's coming next week. You'll definitely want to come back to see where we go. We've got 2 more weeks, and I'm going to tell you right now, knowing a little bit about what's ahead, you'll definitely not want to miss it. We'll see you next week.